Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I am not joined by anyone in the studio today, but I can be joined by you through your questions through your call in to 855-244-0077 or by posting on my Facebook page if you happen to be a Facebook friend of mine or you just want to message me, David J. Kaufman. There are a lot of different things going on in the world this week, and just to talk about a few of them, one of the biggest topics, obviously, still going on is what's going on in Syria and the question of how to respond to potential use of weapons of mass destruction by the Syrian government. There is concern about what to do in Syria at all as things continue to deteriorate, and everybody says, well, we don't like what's going on, but we don't like the other options either. That's all well and good for us to say, but we're dealing with the real world here, and at some point somebody's got to make a decision where we either continue to have people dying in large numbers and do nothing. We allow the regime to be propped up and have the opposition be killed in larger numbers, potentially be wiped out, or we have we prop up the opposition, have the regime collapse, and potentially have people dying in large numbers, or we potentially have a situation in which rebel groups who hate the West, hate Israel, and could potentially cause lots of problems around the world, obtain weapons, and cause problems. That's the real situation. So when we talk about not understanding what to do, the reality is that policymakers need to do something. Doing nothing is not a legitimate alternative, and that's that's the situation right now. We can talk about each of those alternatives and explain why, and I'll talk about why or why not they may be the best way to go. The situation in the Middle East in general is so problematic at this point that it's hard to give a good grasp on what's actually going on. The Arab Spring in many places turned into an Islamist winter, as it said. In some places there seems to be a little bit more freedom, but in other places there's a lot more restriction, there's a lot more fear, there's a lot more chaos. There was even an article today by Victor Davis Hanson that was sent to me by someone Victor Davis Hanson is a conservative writer who wrote about the fact that the Middle East is largely becoming irrelevant, especially after the very large discovery of oil or the reanalysis of the oil discovery in the Dakotas and Montana, in which they discovered that there was vastly more oil there than they had previously estimated. There's now belief that the U.S. can supply its own oil to a very significant extent, much longer than the Middle East could supply it. So that changes the whole dynamic of the Middle East as well. And we are still dealing with the aftermath of the Boston bombings in the news this week. Just yesterday, there were 3 other suspects who were arrested, friends of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who evidently tried to cover up for him after they discovered that he was the bomber. Some question whether they knew anything prior to that. But they certainly did try to cover up after the fact, according to the charges that I have seen in the federal media. Obviously, they will have the ability to defend themselves in court, and they're not guilty until proven so. But it appears, at least, that they tried to cover up for Dzhokhar at some point after the fact. All of these things are things that we can talk about on the show. In addition, there are some concerns about Sudan and Sudanese officials being invited to the United States to speak with the State Department about their humanitarian concerns. And I'd like to address this with you later on. I have a lot of concern about how the United States and the world deals with the situation in Sudan. But this one is particularly bothersome to me because the United States has extended an invitation to Ali Nafi, who happens to be the presidential assistant, but he's historically in charge of the National Intelligence and Security Services in Sudan. This is an extremely problematic guy, and the equivalent of inviting somebody who's been involved in multiple genocides as director of national intelligence and security would be like the United States having invited Heinrich Himmler to come to the United States to speak about humanitarian problems in Germany and Eastern Europe during World War II. Makes no sense. So we can talk about that a little bit later in the show as well. That is The World in 5 Minutes, and this is Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Drink, dance, party. Kitty's is the ultimate dance club in Des Moines. A huge dance floor with room to move, 3 bars to keep your drinks full, and kickin' DJs playing all your favorite dance music. At Kitty's, we've always got your birthday party planned with Birthday Fridays. That's right, when your birthday rolls around, there's only one place to go. Gather up your friends and head to Kitty's, where you drink free on the Friday of your birthday week. Find out more about Birthday Fridays at kittiesusa.com. Kitty's, all kinds of people, all kinds of music, all kinds of fun.
Drug and alcohol addiction slowly steals a person's identity, tearing away pieces of their life little by little until one day it seems like the hope of a happy future is gone and there's no chance of getting it back. Here at St. Gregory Retreat Centers, we can assure you that there is hope. Our unique approach to recovery begins with the understanding that the dysfunction and damage caused by addiction can be overcome, not just dealt with. Don't let another day go by. Call St. Gregory today.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I am happy to take your questions today. Our phone number in the studio is 1-855-244-0077. And there's so many different topics that we can talk about today. I'm trying to get my my little device to get the internet downloaded fast enough here to get to an article about arming the Syrian rebels. And this is from the Times of Israel. There's an article that was published, I guess it was published today, basically that says that the United States government is talking about how to work with the rebels in Syria. So discussions, this is from the Times of Israel article. Discussions within the Obama administration in favor of providing arms to the Syrian rebels are gaining ground amid new indications that President Bashar Assad's regime may have launched additional chemical weapons attacks, U.S. and other officials say. Okay, so first of all, there was the report of a sarin gas attack at one point, and the intelligence agencies in the United States and Israel were questioning whether or not this made sense. Now, part of it, I think, is because the number of casualties from that attack was not super large. When the United States talks about weapons of mass destruction, it's not expecting dozens of casualties. It's expecting hundreds of casualties or thousands of casualties. And so the red line offered by the Obama administration that says if chemical weapons are used, that's a red line, and we'll have to do something about it, may have been made with the understanding that we would see thousands of people die. Well, in the meantime, you're seeing hundreds of people, thousands of people dying every month anyway, or at least every couple months, from the conflict itself. That the Syrian army is very heavily armed. They can do a lot of damage very quickly with conventional weapons. And so they haven't really seen the need to resort to weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological weapons, against the rebel forces. And as I talked about last week, the Syrian army itself is concerned that the rebels get a hold of these weapons of mass destruction because they would be more likely to use them. In fact, the United States may well have been under the assumption that the people least likely to use the weapons of mass destruction, least likely to use these chemical and biological weapons, were in fact the Syrian government. That the Syrian government would worry about enticing the United States and Europe and others to get involved in the conflict, to get into the conflict and work with the rebels based on the use of these chemical and biological weapons. Whereas if the opposition got them, okay, and the opposition potentially having no central authority and knowing where the Syrian government supporters live, could well use them. The rebel groups, including some Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, for sure could be a possibility of using them. So there was an assumption that the least likely group potentially could have been the Syrian government. Well, if the Syrian government has now been proven to have used those weapons, you're now in a situation in which no one can be trusted to not use them, obviously, and that means that these weapons are not really being secured. They're actually being readily made available. And if that's the case, then you're dealing with a situation in which the response time needed to secure these weapons in case anything happens is much faster. We're not dealing with weaponry that is buried under 10 feet of dirt that we can have some time to find, as we can see bulldozers and other earth-moving equipment moving in to try to get at them. These weapons are readily available. And like I said, the problem with that is somebody busts a door down and they march into a building, all of a sudden they have access to these weapons. That is a much more dangerous situation. So this article says, as the number of suspected attacks grows, U.S. officials said intelligence agencies are seeing signs that Syrian opposition forces may be distancing themselves from the Al-Qaeda-linked group there. Okay, now there may be multiple Al-Qaeda-linked groups there. So I question the language in this article. The specific one is a group called Al-Nusra, which was at one point made the official leader of the rebel groups, of the organized rebel groups. The Free Syrian Army, however, which is the main opposition to the government, is not connected to those groups. You have to understand that the Free Syrian Army are not Al-Qaeda affiliated. They're in opposition to the Alawites. That's President Bashar Assad's group. And they're not Al-Qaeda. Now, the question is, are they Muslim Brotherhood? Yes, they are. They're connected to a number of other groups in the region which the United States may have some difficulty working, but not as bad as the Al-Qaeda groups. The United States is evidently seeing signs that the Syrian opposition forces may be distancing themselves from the Al-Qaeda-linked group there, quote-unquote, chipping away at one of the key arguments against giving lethal aid to the rebels. Yet at the same time, the fighters associated with the extremist group are among the most effective against the regime. You get that? These rebel Al-Qaeda guys, they're really effective. They're the ones who could make most use of the weapons. So maybe we should give them the weapons. This is what the thought process is. Let's just think about that for a second. The thought process here, at least as stated in this article, is twofold. First of all, what signs there are that these groups are moving away from Al-Qaeda, I have no idea. That's first question. I don't know. Hopefully the government has real concrete information that that's the case. But they made the Al-Qaeda group the leader to begin with. So are we going to say that the reason they're publicly moving away from the Al-Qaeda group is because they want the weapons from the United States, so that they're simply going to say, we're not in the pocket of Al-Qaeda anymore? Give us the weapons, and then they'll have al-Nusra and the Al-Qaeda group lead them once they get the weapons? We don't know. That would certainly be a major concern of mine. But in the meantime, we also have this idea that the Al-Qaeda group is the most effective. And so there may actually be people saying, let's arm the Al-Qaeda group, just not give them anything they can use against us. Very, very problematic thought process here. Officials insisted Wednesday that no decisions have been made, but said arming the rebels is seen more likely and preferable than any other military option. One U.S. official described a new reconsideration within the administration of the military options. The officials who spoke on condition of anonymity because they weren't authorized to discuss publicly the options under consideration said most U.S. leaders prefer that the Syrians determine their own fate, so arming the opposition is more palatable than U.S. intervention. Well, absolutely. We really have nothing to gain there because we can't, if we put in any of the groups, none of these groups are groups that are necessarily going to be good friends of the United States. We're not dealing with people who are going to be long-term friends of the United States, no matter which group we put in power here. So when we talk about regime change in Syria, if we're going to talk about regime change in Syria, we're not talking about something that's going to be of great benefit to the United States and all of a sudden make the world a much better place. We're dealing with the worst of multiple evils here. Better or worse of multiple evils. And it would make more sense for other groups to intervene as long as we could figure out what it is. Like I said, the issue here really is determining how to get the best of those multiple evils to work. That's really what we want. We do want to influence the policy so that it goes in the best direction, because that's what the job of foreign policy and diplomacy is. It's just that there's no good here. So the amount of investment that we do, especially when we're talking about lives, is a big question, because we have to determine whether or not any of the final solutions here, any of the solutions that are going to settle the conflict, are going to be good enough for us to justify investment of troops or investment of weapons. And if we do invest weapons, then the question is, do those weapons come back to literally bite us? So the administration announced last week that it believes Assad has used chemical weapons, but said intelligence wasn't clear enough to be certain that the regime had crossed President Barack Obama's announced red line of definite chemical weapons use, that he would have enormous consequences, that he said would have enormous consequences for Assad's government. Meanwhile, some senior leaders, including General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are skeptical about the wisdom of providing arms to such a broad and complex mix of opposition groups. There is a growing realization that under increasing pressure from Congress and other allied nations, the U.S. might soon have to do more for the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army, like I said, is not part of the rebel groups, but they're also not seen as being super effective at the moment. And it's very problematic. We may well have done, in fact, I know there were articles to this effect that I read from Jonathan Tobin and others over the past months. We may well have gone too far waiting to side with somebody in Syria. That if we had sided with the Free Syrian Army months ago, they may have been in a much better position to act than they will now, even if we arm them to the extent we would have then. There's too much else going on. There's too many other things happening there, to simply arm them now and hope for the same result. So, President Obama signaled Tuesday he would consider U.S. military action against Syria if hard, effective evidence is found to bolster intelligence that chemical weapons have been used in the civil war. We don't want to back ourselves into a corner. The problem with declaring red lines and then certainly reinforcing red lines is eventually you have to act based on the red lines. And let's say one wacko commander of the Syrian army decides that he's going to use a mortar shell filled with sarin gas and kills 36 people. Is that crossing the red line enough? For some people, they would say absolutely yes. But if the United States goes in there with troops, we're going to be talking about thousands of dead, not tens of dead. That's one thing, okay? The other thing is we could be installing a regime that it isn't going to be better than the one we're taking out. Yes, it would be better in that we'd hope that they wouldn't have access to the weapons technology. But we really have difficulty figuring out what we want to see set up there. The idea of going in and setting up some sort of free democracy that's going to be pro-Western and make nice with the United States and Israel and our allies for years to come is almost an impossibility, even if it's led by the Free Syrian Army. Free Syrian Army at best is going to be more like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and maybe more like Tunisia, where we have all kinds of problems right now. So we need to be very careful in what we're doing. A key obstacle in the debate over providing weapons has been U.S. concerns that any U.S. weapons would end up in the hands of al-Qaeda-linked groups helping the Syrian opposition or any of the other extremist groups in the region, such as Lebanon-based Hezbollah. Because we don't really have a good grasp and the situation is so unstable there, we could provide weapons to a rebel group, have the rebel group overrun by Hezbollah, and have the weapons that we provided the rebel group end up in the hands of Hezbollah. That's certainly possible. Any number of other questions and issues could come up. Last month, the head of the extremist group Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the leader, the recognized leader of the rebels group, okay, the recognized group leading the rebels, pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. And U.S. officials say that since then they have seen anecdotal evidence and intelligence assessments that suggest that al-Nusra's gains within Syria have slowed, both because of the group's public links to al-Qaeda and the designation of al-Nusra as a terrorist organization. Other opposition members, they said, now appear to view al-Nusra more warily. Certainly possible. The question is, can we vet these people? And as we move forward with trying to figure out how to deal with this situation, vetting the opposition parties in Syria and figuring out if we can work with any of them, and if we can work with any of them, how, is going to be the biggest question we've got. Can we trust the Free Syrian Army to not work with any of these other rebel groups that we don't believe that we should be working with? Is that possible? Is it possible that those rebel groups are going to attack Free Syrian Army troops and all of a sudden the weapons that we give the Free Syrian Army are not going to be in the hands of the Free Syrian Army anymore? There could be any number of other problems come up. We need to address all of them before we get involved. And if I were to tell you that this is the most complicated situation foreign policy-wise that we've seen in a long time, I don't think it would be much of an understatement. I don't think it would be an overstatement. I think it'd be an understatement. This situation is vastly complicated, and there is no simple situation whatsoever. So we'll talk more about that in the weeks ahead. I think there may be questions that we can talk about after a short break. There's so much going on in the world, and understanding it takes quite a bit of time and effort. That's what we're doing here. It's what I'm doing here on understanding the world and what my guests help us do week in, week out. I'd like to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman for his support of this show. Dr. Ronald Bergman is at Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa. You can find them at Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery, bergmanfolkers.com, excuse me. And I will talk to you more after a very short break. Thank you for being with us on Understanding the World.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershide.
I'm administrative manager
I am the senior technician
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're gonna do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's gonna be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're gonna do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you gonna say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're gonna be listening. They're gonna wanna know what your challenges are. Then they're gonna come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me, but is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going though, I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm gonna take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. We're going to shift topics just a little bit here. And I want to talk about the peace process. And I want to talk about how we should go about getting the sides to, or how and if we as Americans can work on getting the sides to work together. Yesterday, the last couple of days really, there have been articles about the Arab League meeting and the statement by the representative from Qatar, Al-Thani, about the fact that the Arab League, or that he would be willing to have Israel and the Palestinians talk about the 1967 borders with minor land swaps. And this has suddenly created a firestorm of people who think that the Arab League has radically changed in support of the peace process. I don't think that's true at all. And it's certainly not true based on what I've actually seen coming from the Arab League. There seems to be this belief that if we pretend something is happening, it'll create a reality. It's difficult to make policy and to work on changing the world when you deal with the reality of the world. When you deal with hopeful things that are just wishful thinking, that becomes even more difficult. In this case, the Arab position all along has been the 1967 borders, more or less, with all of the old city of Jerusalem coming onto the Palestinian side, and the right of return of all the refugees, not just from 1967 into the places they were in 1967, but the refugees and their descendants from the 1948 war coming into Israel. They haven't changed those positions. So let's talk about what actually did change, just as an aside. So if for a moment we make the argument that the Arab League radically changed its position so that it would accept some compromise on the 1967 borders, they're not talking about a big compromise, folks. They're talking about, we're going to exchange 20 acres worth of desert land for another 20 acres of desert land. They're not talking about, let's exchange 500 acres of central Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, for 500 acres of desert land outside Hebron. That's not what they're talking about. And so when we're talking about big changes as a reason for peace, we're just not there. In addition, there's a question of, why does it even matter that the Arab League's position has changed? People are not answering that question, and I can tell you why they're not answering that question. Because there are times when they would like to see the Palestinian Authority as actually representing Palestinians and not Palestinian Authority being used by the Arab League representing Arabs. If the Arab League's position on peace matters at all, it is because the Palestinians are not truly independent from the independent negotiators from the Arab League. Think about that for a minute. The Arab League includes a lot of countries that have no desire for peace for Israel, and certainly have no desire to allow the Palestinians to make concessions for peace. The 1948 war and the 1967 war were not wars between Israelis and Palestinians. They were both wars between Jews, in 1948 between Jews and Arabs, and then in 1967 between Israelis and Arabs. Neither one of these wars were with Palestinians. And the resolution of the war right now, the resolution of the conflict right now, is not going to be solely between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So who else is involved in this process? Well, involved in this process, you have countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the other Arab League countries. Well, some of those countries that would have been more inclined to think about allowing the Palestinians to make an agreement with the Israelis and creating an Israeli-Arab peace agreement have now become Muslim Brotherhood nations who are less disposed to make any concessions whatsoever. That's a problem. The changes in the last 2 years in the Arab world have made the Arab League as a whole less likely to be able to work with Israel, even though certain individual countries are more likely to work with Israel. In fact, Saudi Arabia, as Barry Rubin recently talked about, may well be more inclined to make peace with Israel now than it has in the past because it's worried about Iran. And it's worried about groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and changes in other parts of the world. So they may be more willing because they have to shift their attention elsewhere. They want to cooperate with Israel if they can in any way. So the peace process is one in which it's largely based on hope. It's largely based on wishful thinking. But some of the time, it's based on wanting the United States to do something about it, to jumpstart the process, to push the sides to negotiate. And a lot of the time, the focus comes on pressuring Israel because the United States doesn't really have the ability to pressure the Palestinians. The United States doesn't have the ability to pressure the Arab League to pressure the Palestinians. So peace activists sometimes want to pressure the United States or get the United States to pressure Israel to make concessions. And in 2010, I and a number of others helped create an organization called We Are for Israel, which was specifically created to deal with that situation among those who wanted a two-state solution. We are a two-state solution organization. We have over 350 rabbis from around the world signed on to our mission statement. And those rabbis are generally progressive rabbis. They tend to be reform and conservative rabbis. There are a few Orthodox rabbis. There are even a couple of ultra-Orthodox rabbis, Haredi rabbis, who are signed on because we do believe in a secure and strong Israel as our priority. But we believe in a certain kind of advocacy. And I think it's important to understand the advocacy that we advance, that we promote, because I think it's important to understand how we can go about finding the peace process, finding a process that works, and how we can go about supporting Israel and the creation of a Palestinian state at the same time. So this is a document that comes from the weareforisrael.org website. It's called Advocacy on the website. It says where our advocacy differs. And the first one, singling out Israel for criticism. We believe that it is illegitimate to single out Israel for blame and censure in respect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even in the context of blaming both sides. Offering general criticism of the Palestinians while specifically condemning Israeli policies and actions amounts to a double standard that obscures history in a morally questionable manner. And I'll give you many, many, many examples of this that critics of Israel will put forward. They will say things like Israel's actions to launch a strike that killed certain terrorist leader, Israel's actions in Cast Lead, Israel's actions in arresting certain leaders, any number of other things. They'll specifically criticize that. Then they will say something along the lines of, and we also criticize the Palestinians for supporting the use of terror. What? The reason they do that is because they can't specifically condemn the Palestinians for their many actions, because they'd end up with a much longer list on one side and a much shorter list on the other. And in addition, the lists are not equivalent. Somebody who's plotting in the Palestinian Authority to commit an act of terror where their target is, as my guest last week, Arnold Roth, noted, women and children who happen to be in a restaurant because of the pain and fear that such an attack creates in the population, and comparing that with an Israeli attack on the individual planning the event, they're not equivalent at all. You can't even put them in the same ballpark of criticism. You can't put into the same conversation a discussion of thousands of rockets falling on Israeli villages in the south of Israel from Gaza and the Israeli retaliation against the people firing the rockets. That's not a cycle of violence. That is a sane defense of civilians on the one hand, and incomprehensible evil on the other. That's not a matter of resistance fighting. If you know that you're firing rockets into civilian populations with the express intent of killing civilians, that's called a war crime. Crime against humanity. Crime against humanity and the war crime is not collateral damage from going after a legitimate military target. Let's say even in that case, and Israel goes out of its way to avoid these things, but let's say even in that case, Israel attacks a rocket squad driving through a Palestinian area. They have so much weaponry in their van that when the rocket hits, the van blows up and shrapnel goes around and civilians standing on the street happen to be killed. It's unfortunate that the civilians on the street happen to be killed. They were not the intent of the Israeli. They were not the targets of the Israeli attack in that case. But they're also not. That's not a war crime. It's not gross use of excessive violence, and it's not a crime against humanity. However, the intent of the people in the van to use those weapons to blow up Israeli kindergartens, if they could, firing the rockets indiscriminately at civilian areas. That is a war crime. Do these things get discussed as much in that vein? No, of course not. There's not even remotely close to a reasonable discussion. And until people engage in that reasonable discussion, in my mind, they have no validity. A number of the peace groups that promote themselves as advocates for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians promote at best moral equivalence, which basically is no morality at all, and try to promote the actions of people intending on murdering women and children as equivalent to the people trying to stop them from doing it. Another thing that our advocacy statement says, seeking unilateral concessions from Israel. We believe that pressuring Israel alone to make concessions is not only unjustified, but frequently motivated by political interest, naivete, ignorance, misinformation, or even anti-Judaism. Any concessions should be made in the context of peace process and should be reciprocal in nature. In other words, Israel shouldn't be continually asked to offer concessions to get the Palestinians to come to the negotiating table. You come to the negotiating table and you negotiate. That's not what's normally done. Advocating boycott, divestment, or sanctions against Israel. We believe that actions designed to weaken Israel's economy and harm her society should be viewed as being anti-Israel and must be opposed by Israel advocates. Those favoring these tactics are functionally negotiating for the Palestinian side and diminishing the likelihood that the Palestinians will enter into peace negotiations themselves. Why should the Palestinians make concessions if they have advocates in the United States and other countries around the world working for them to try to put pressure on Israel to make concessions? This only prolongs the situation, because what ends up happening is you end up fighting about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions instead of figuring out how to actually achieve peace. That's a simple reality, and in fact, it's proven out. The boycott, divestment, sanctions regime started post-2001 for the most part, and guess what? There's been almost no negotiations or anything going on since then. So the focus shifting from let's figure out how to get peace, which was the focus of the 1990s, up to 2000 Camp David, has now shifted to how do we deal with boycott, divestment, and sanctions regimes. And I will tell you that among peace activists, it's been a waste of time because it hasn't achieved anything whatsoever. There haven't even been negotiations for years at this point. And when you talk about actual process, it's actually put the process even further away. The Palestinians now feel obligated to try to push these boycott, divestment, and sanctions regimes and work with the people who are promoting them instead of figuring out how to work together with the Israelis to actually achieve something. It's been a colossal waste of time, and it's resulted in deaths from the prolonging and more suffering from the prolonging of the process. So they don't work. I would encourage people to actively work against people promoting those, not only because I think they're bad for Israel, but I also think they're bad for the peace process. seeking action by the United States to pressure Israel to yield to Palestinian demands. We believe that America should support Israel in its efforts to negotiate a secure and lasting peace with the Palestinians by working with Israel and the Palestinians to reach that goal. America should not work against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians by pressuring Israel to accept Palestinian demands while receiving nothing in return. The mere appearance of one-sided pressure on Israel fosters Palestinian intransigence and encourages their refusal to come to the negotiating table. This tactic is neither pro-Israel nor pro-peace. Okay, this was the case in 2009 with President Obama's Cairo speech, where he criticized Israeli settlements. And the result of that over the next few months was an Israeli settlement freeze. They didn't construct in settlements in the West Bank at all, and didn't create any new settlements during that time. Okay? There weren't any negotiations for the 10 months. Zero. And there haven't been since. Instead of the Palestinians having to figure out how to get to the negotiating table with the Israelis, what ended up happening is the Obama administration ended up getting into the negotiations, putting forth the proposal. The Palestinians couldn't accept less than the proposal that the Obama administration had put forth, and therefore we got no negotiation since. None. We believe that heightening awareness of Palestinian obligations and responsibilities is a prerequisite for advancing the peace process. We believe this to be an essential part of Israeli advocacy. These commitments include actively combating the use of violence against Israel, ending the glorification of those who have committed acts of violence, and ceasing the incitement of hatred against Israel and against Jews, especially in school curricula and in state-sponsored media. Peace should be promoted. That's not happening at all. The Palestinian Authority continues to produce movies, print media, issue speeches, declare public parks and other things in the name of terrorists, including suicide bombers who murder children. It is absolutely not the case that educating for peace is moving forward. It's one of the major obligations of the Palestinian Authority. It's to lay the groundwork for the possibility of movement on the peace front, and it's not happening. And peace activists generally don't even talk about it. Big problem. Criticizing Israel when Israel acts to ensure the safety of her citizens. We believe that Israel has an absolute right to self-defense. The only way to reduce significantly the need for heightened defenses, including the naval blockade of Gaza and the West Bank security barrier, is through the peace process. When difficult choices must be made between the safety of Israel's citizens and the needs or convenience of Palestinians, the right to self-defense must come first. This idea that Israel can open the security barrier and make life of the Palestinians simpler while weakening its security dramatically and allowing terrorists to come in and blow people up is ridiculous. It's just not going to happen. So unless the threat of terrorism against the Israeli civilians is reduced, the essential need for heightened security is maintained. That's the end of the discussion. The Israelis aren't even considering anything with the security barrier. It's not going to happen. It's greatly reduced the amount of terrorism against Israel, dramatically reduced the amount of terrorism in Israel. It has saved many, many, many lives. So talking about, they need to ease restrictions on it, it's just not going to happen. Get to the peace process. Then you can move forward with that. Turning support for Israel into a partisan issue. We believe that our advocacy should not be motivated or influenced by political party affiliation. Best course for Israeli advocacy is nonpartisan approach that welcomes support for Israel from all and eschews it from none. Demeaning or vilifying Israel's elected leaders. We believe that Israel democratically elected leaders, no matter what their political leanings, should be treated with respect and offered support in the pursuit of the goals of security, prosperity, and peace. And then finally, before we take a short break, careless words exploited by Israel's detractors and enemies. We believe that we must consider how others might use, distort, or manipulate our words in reference to Israel. We have seen and heard the words of Jewish leaders and organizations, often offered out of concern for Israel, utilized by those who seek to harm her. This is especially so in the case of those promoting the use of boycott, sanctions, and divestment schemes because they are Jews. Individual Jews, words can be twisted. Individual Jews can be on the wrong side of issues. It's important for us to understand all of that. Thank you for being with us on Understanding the World today. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
There's an article by Victor David Hanson I mentioned earlier that I just wanted to talk about really briefly here about the changing Middle East and the dynamics of the changing economies of the world and their impact on the relevance of the Middle East to the discussion. So Hansen notes that with the 20th century development of large gas and oil supplies in the Persian Gulf and North Africa, an Arab-led OPEC more or less dictated the foreign policy of thirsty oil importers like the United States and Europe. Yet, he says, the Middle East is becoming irrelevant. The discovery of enormous new oil and gas reserves, along with the use of new oil recovery technology in North America and China, is steadily curbing the demand for Middle Eastern oil. Soon, countries such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iran are going to have less income and geostrategic clout. In both Iran and the Gulf, domestic demand is rising, while there is neither the technical know-how nor the water to master the new art of fracking to sustain exports. You also have a situation in which Israel has discovered oil and discovered oil and natural gas off its shores, primarily in the Eastern Mediterranean, and will become a net fuel exporter in the next few years. Not even very far off into the future, just in the next few years. Additionally, you have the United States with enormous oil and gas discoveries in North Dakota, South Dakota, and in Montana. And the importance of this cannot be overlooked. What it means is that at any point in time, we can say we don't want to deal with the Middle East anymore. At any point in time, we can get to the point where we can just keep shifting our oil supplies from the Middle East to our own shores. And it's clearly an environmental issue. I'm not going to say that there aren't issues with us doing that. But when you come to a situation of, do we want to support countries that are promoting extremism and potentially bringing terrorism to our shores? Or do we want to take a more environmentally risky policy, which is potentially what the decision would be? We may well get to the point where the environmentally risky policy makes more sense. And as the technology improves to make the acquisition of the oil and natural gas that's in those areas less environmentally problematic, we're going to see it tipping more and more in that direction. And you're going to see it the discussion tipping more and more in that direction for the Russians. You're going to see it tipping more and more in that direction for the United States, for Canada, for any number of other countries who are going to say, you know what? We would rather pay slightly more for that American gas, that American oil. Or the Russians are going to say, we would rather try to get it by fracking in the North Sea or somewhere else, rather than trying to work with those people in the Middle East who are causing us problems. What you're going to see is increased desperation. What you're going to see is a people who right now have money around them and are feeling like religiously they're not respected, are going to find themselves both feeling religiously not respected and feeling irrelevant in the larger world. For the people who go out and fight in the name of their religion, irrelevance is not acceptable. The whole reason they're out there doing what they're doing is to promote the glory of their faith, to promote the glory of their culture. It doesn't really matter what religion we're talking about. You could generalize that statement. In this case, we're talking about certain kinds of Muslim extremists, but we could be talking about any kind of religious extremist. It's the same thing. People who believe that God has blessed them and that that they should be in a position of glory and honor don't take irrelevance very well. Because irrelevance is a good indication that none of that is true. If no one cares about you, it's a good indication that quite possibly divine beings don't care about you either. And if you're a devout believer, that's a really big problem. So what you end up doing is trying to get attention, trying to draw attention to your cause, trying to say that if only you were more devout, more active, worked harder, that attention would be paid to you, not just by other people, but by the divine. And this is why the idea that the Middle East could become more irrelevant as a whole is not necessarily going to get rid of the terrorist threat at all. In fact, in some places, it may make it worse. I don't like giving you negative information when things could be wonderful. The good thing is, obviously, there'd be less money going in there. That have less ability to purchase weapons to use against us. But when you're talking about looking at what happened in Boston, these two bombers in Boston barely spent any money. The 9/11 hijackers really didn't spend all that much money either. It does not cost a lot of money to conduct terrorism. It does cost a lot of money to maintain the lavish lifestyle of the rulers of these countries. The hopeful thing, if there is a hopeful thing, would be a transition of these economies from oil-based economies where all the money is going into the hands of very few, very wealthy people to some sort of service-based economy or industry where the average person gets jobs. And here's where I agree with many of my left-wing friends. empowerment of the average person is really what's going to change the dynamic in the Middle East. Places where you have unemployment of 20 plus, 30 plus percent, 40%, and even where the 60% or 70% that are employed are grossly underpaid and suffering. That's not good for people's satisfaction with this life. It's not good for people's satisfaction of wanting to make the world a better place. That needs to change. So in the long run, we may say the Middle East is becoming irrelevant. It needs to become relevant in a different way. It needs to become a place where we're seeing made in the Middle East coming out of factories. It needs to be a place where we can look to this region and say there are good thoughts coming out of the region. Somebody's winning the Nobel Prize. Somebody's written great books. Somebody's done wonderful songs. That development is what's really going to bring peace to the world. And that development requires education, requires investment of time and energy, in addition to funds. And it requires a good bit of patience, which many of us don't have. That's the challenge we face in the years ahead. Next week on this show, we are joined by one of my good friends, Professor Barry Rubin. Many of you have read his articles over the years in Jerusalem Post. He now writes for Pajamas Media. He has his own blog, rubinreports.blogspot.com. Absolute wonderful person, great authority on what's going on in the Middle East. We're honored to have him on our show next week. And then coming up on May 16th, we have Dexter Van Zyl from Camera looking at Middle East, looking at media related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He'll actually be in the studio with us. He's speaking at Temple B'nai Jeshurun that evening. This has been Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I hope you enjoyed the show. You learned something. You may know some of the story, but you haven't heard the whole story until you've heard it here on this show. And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa for their support. Thank you, and I hope you have a good week.